Good evening, everybody. We are going to continue our reading of Lassie Come Home by Eric Knight, and we are on the chapter called Don't Come Home Anymore. Wow, this sounds like a very sad part of the book. That boy sure loves his dog, doesn't he? So, here we are. If Mrs. Carraclaw thought that everything was settled, then she was mistaken. For the very next day, Lassie was at the school gate, keeping her faithful tryst, waiting for Joe. And again, Joe brought her home. On his way, he planned to fight for his dog. To him, the course was simple. He felt that when his parents saw the dog's faithfulness, that they would relent and let her stay with them again, and thus reward her. But he knew it would not be easy for him to persuade them. Slowly, he walked up the path with the dog and opened the door. Everything in the cottage was as it had been before, his mother getting the evening meal ready, his father brooding in front of the fire, as he did for hours these days since there was no work. She's come home again, Joe said. All his hopes fled at his mother's first words. There was no surrender in them. I won't have it. No, I won't have it, she cried. You can't bring her in, and it's no use begging and plaguing me. She's got to go right back, right this minute. The words cascaded over Joe. In the strict bringing up of his Yorkshire home, with its stern kindness, it was rare that he answered back, as the saying is, to his parents. But this time he felt he must try, must make them understand. But Mother, just a little while, please, just a little while. Let me keep her here just a little while. He felt that if he could only keep her there a short time, the hearts of his parents would soften. Perhaps Lassie felt that too, for as Joe talked, she walked in and went to her accustomed place on the hearth rug. As if she knew the talk was of her, she lay down, turning her eyes from one to another of the humans who usually spoke so quietly, but whose voices now were harsh. It's no use, Joe. The longer you keep her here, the harder it's going to be to take her back. And go back she must. But Mother, Father, look, please, she doesn't look well. They don't feed her right. Don't you think? Joe's father got up and faced his son. The man's face was blank and emotionless, but his voice was full of understanding. That won't work this time, Joe, he said ponderously. You see, lad, it's no use. We maun take her back right after tea. No, you take her back right this very minute, Mrs. Carraclaw cried. And if you don't, you'll have that Hines round here again, and I won't have him walking into my house as he owned it. Now, put on your cap and go this very minute. She'll only come back again, Mother, don't you see? She'll only come back again. She's our dog. Joe stopped as his mother sank down in her chair in a movement of weariness. She looked at her husband, and he nodded, as if to say Joe was right. She comes back for the lad, you see, the father said. I can't help it, Sam. She's got to go, Mrs. Carraclaw said slowly. And if it's the lad she comes back for, then ye must take him with ye. Let him go with ye, and he must put her in the kennels and tell her to stay. Then if he bid her rest there, happen she'd understand and be content, and not run away home any more. Aye, there's sense to that, the man said slowly. Get thy cap, Joe, and come with me. Miserably, Joe got his cap, and the man made a soft whistling sound. Lassie rose obediently. Then the man, the boy, and the dog left the cottage. Behind him, Joe could hear his mother's voice still going on, but full of weariness, as if she would soon cry from her tiredness. If she'd stay, then happen we could have a little peace and quiet in the home, though heaven knows there's not much chance of that these days, things being what they are. Joe heard her voice trail away as silently as he followed his father and Lassie. Grandfather, Priscilla said, can animals hear things that we can't? Oh, yes, of course, the Duke roared. Take a dog now. He hears 5 times as well as a human being. For instance, my silent dog whistle. It isn't silent, really. It makes high-frequency sounds, but we don't hear them. No human can. A dog hears them, though, and comes running. That's because... Priscilla saw her grandfather start, and then began waving his blackthorn stick menacingly as he went down the path. Carraclaw, what are you doing there with my dog? Priscilla saw down the path a great, tall village man, and beside him a sturdy boy, who stood with his hand resting lightly on the mane of a collie. She heard the dog growl softly, as if in protest at the menacing advance of her grandfather, and then the low voice of the boy quieting the dog. She followed her grandfather toward the strangers. Sam Carraclaw, seeing her coming, lifted his cap and poked his son to do likewise. This was not in any sense a servile gesture, but because many of the rough village people prided themselves in being well brought up and conducting themselves with politeness. "It's Lassie," Carraclaw said. "Of course it's Lassie," the Duke boomed. "Any fool can see that." "What are you doing with her?" "She's run away again, and I'm bringing her back to you." "Again? Has she run away before?" Sam Carraclaw stood silent. Like most of the village people, his mind moved very slowly. From the Duke's last words, he realized that Hines had not told of her previous escape, and if he answered the Duke's question, he felt in some way that he would be telling tales on Hines. Even though he disliked Hines, he could not tell on him, for, as he phrased it in his own honest mind, he wouldn't like to do a man out of his job. Hines might be discharged, and jobs were hard to get these days. Sam Carraclaw knew that. He solved his problem with the typical Yorkshire way. Stubbornly he repeated his last words. "I'm bringing her back, that's all." The Duke stared at him menacingly. Then he lifted his voice even louder. "Hines! Hines! Why does that man always run away and hide every time I want him? Hines!" "Coming, sir, coming," came the nasal voice. Soon Hines came hustling from behind the shrubberies beside the kennels. "Hines, has this dog broken away before?" Hines squirmed uneasily. "Well, sir, it's this way. Did she or didn't she?" "Well, in a way, sir, she did. But I didn't want to disturb your grace about her," Hines said, fingering his cap nervously. "But I'll jolly well see she doesn't get away again. Can't think how she did it. I wired up all the places she dug underneath, and I'll see." "You'd better," the Duke shouted. "Utter nincompoop, that's what. I begin to think you're an utter nincompoop. Hines, pen her up. If she breaks out again, I'll... The Duke did not finish explaining what dire things he intended to do, but instead went stumping away in an evil temper, without so much as a thank you, to Sam Carraclaw. Priscilla somehow felt that, for she started to follow her grandfather, but then halted. She turned and, standing quietly, watched the scene that he had left. Hines was stirring angrily. "I'll pin her up," he muttered, "and if she ever gets away again, I'll—" He didn't finish the sentence, for as he spoke, he made as if to grasp Lassie's mane. But he never reached the dog, for Sam Carraclaw's heavy hobnailed boot trod on Hines' foot, pinning him to his position. The man spoke slowly. "I brought my lad with me to pen her up this time," he said. "It's him she runs home for, and so he'll pen her up and bid her to stay." Then the cumbrous Yorkshire voice lifted, and as if Sam Carraclaw had just noticed something. Now I'm sorry. I didn't hardly notice I were standing on thy foot. Come along, Joe, lad. Unlatch the kennel for us, Hines, and we'll put her in." Priscilla, standing still beside the aged evergreens, saw the dog come through from the kennel to the run. As the boy came by the wire, she lifted her head and then walked to him. The collie pressed against the wire, and for a long moment the boy stood there, his fingers reaching through the mesh to touch the coolness of the dog's nose. The man ended the silence. "Come on, Joe, lad, now get it over with. There's no use stretching it out. Bid her to stay. Tell her we can't have her coming home no more." Priscilla saw the boy by the kennels look up at his father, and then glance around, as if there would be some help coming from somewhere. But there was none. There was no help anywhere for Joe, and he swallowed and started to speak, his words coming slowly in a low tone, but getting faster and faster as he spoke. "Stay here and bide happy, Lassie," he began, his voice hardly audible, "and don't come home no more. Don't run away no more. Don't come to school for me no more. You stay here and let us be, because you don't belong to us no more, and we don't want to ever see thee ever again, because that's a bad dog, and we don't love thee no more, and we don't want to see thee, so don't plague us and come running home. Stay here forever and leave us be, and never come home again." The dog, as if it understood, walked to the far corner of the kennel and lay down. The boy turned savagely and started away. Because it was hard for him to see where he was going, he stumbled. But his father, who was walking beside him with his head very high and his gaze straight ahead, caught him by the shoulder and shook him and said roughly, "Look where you're going." Joe trotted beside his father, who walked quickly. He was thinking that he would never be able to understand why grown-ups were so hard-hearted just when you needed them most. He ran beside his father, thinking that, and not understanding that the man wanted to get away from the sound that followed them, the sound of a collie, barking bravely, calling to her master not to desert her. Joe did not understand that. And there was another who found many things hard to understand. It was Priscilla, who came closer to the run where the collie now stood, her eyes fixed unmovingly to the spot where she had last seen her master turn the corner down the path, her head lifting with a single bark. Priscilla watched the dog until Heinz came from the front of the kennels. She called to him, "Heinz." "Yes, Miss Priscilla?" "Why does the dog run home to them? Isn't she happy here?" "Why, bless your heart, Miss Priscilla, of course she's happy. A fine kennel like she's got. She just runs home because they've trained her to do it. That's the way they do, steal 'em back and sell 'em to somebody before you could say Bob's your uncle." Priscilla wrinkled her nose and thought, but if they wanted to steal her back, why did they return her themselves? "Now, just you don't worry your pretty head about it," Heinz said. "It's just you can't trust none of 'em down in that village. They're always up to tricks, they are, but we're too smart for 'em." Priscilla thought a while. But if the boy wanted his dog back, why did they ever sell her in the first place? If she was my dog, I wouldn't sell her. Of course you wouldn't, Miss Priscilla. Then why did they? Why did they? Because your grandfather paid him a bloomin' good price for her, he did. That's why, a bloomin' good price. He's too easy on him, that's what. If I'd had my way, I'd make him step round a bit. That I would, indeed. Satisfaction with his solution, Heinz turned to the dog, which still stood barking its signal. "Quiet now. Go on down, Wiver. Go on down, Wiver, in your kennel and lie down. Go on." As the dog made no sign of having heard him, Heinz strode nearer and lifted his hand in a striking gesture. Slowly, Lassie turned, and from her chest sounded a bass rumbling, and the lips crept upward so that the great teeth shone whitely. Her ears drew back, and the mane on her neck rose slowly. The rumbling growl seemed louder. Heinz halted, and he rolled his tongue between his gaping front teeth. "Oh, so you get nasty, would yer?" he said. Then Priscilla walked before him. Look out, Miss Priscilla. I wouldn't go too near if I were you. She'd just as lief take a bite out of yer as look at her, if I knows dogs, which I do, but I'll have that fine lady steppin' around for him through with her, that I will, so you keep away from her, miss." And Heinz turned away. For a long time Priscilla stood. Then slowly she walked to the wiring. She put her fingers through so that they were close to Lassie's head. "Come here then, girl," she said softly. "Come to me. Come on. I won't hurt you. Come on." The dog's growling subsided, and she sank to the ground. For 1 second, her great brown eyes met the blue ones of the girl. Then the dog ignored her, and with a sort of suffering aristocratic majesty, she lay in the pen. Her eyes did not blink, and her head did not turn. She lay there, staring steadily at the spot where she had last seen Sam Carraclaw and his son. The next chapter is called The Hiding Place on the Moor. There she is laying down in her kennel. The next day Lassie lay in her pen, the early summer sunlight streaming on her coat. Her head rested on her paws. It was pointing in the direction that Sam Carraclaw and his son had gone that evening before. Her ears were lifted, thrown forward, so that although her body was at rest, her senses were awake to any sight or sound or smell that might mean her masters were returning. But the afternoon was quiet. There was the hum of early bees in the air, the smell of the damp English countryside. That was all. The afternoon deepened, and Lassie began to stir. There was some impulse warning her faintly. It was indistinct, indefinable, perhaps as when an alarm clock rings to disturb but dimly a still sleeping human being. Lassie lifted her head suddenly and scented the breeze, but this did not give her any quieting answer to the vague stirrings within her. She got up, walked slowly toward the kennel, and lay down in the shade. That did not bring her any ease. She got up again and walked back to the sun, but that was not the answer. The curious urging in her mind drove more strongly. She began walking about the pen, circling around, walking by the stout mesh wire. The force within her drove her to walking round and around, going circle after circle about her cage. Then in one corner she halted, and with her paw she clawed the wire. As if that were the signal, now she suddenly understood her desire. It was time to go for the boy. It was not that she thought this plainly, as a human being might. She knew it only blindly, but the impulse held her entirely and drove everything else away from her feeling or awareness. She only knew that it was time to go to the school as she had gone every day for so many years. She clawed vigorously at the wire, but she made little impression. Memory told her that she had escaped there before, clawing, tearing at the wire, and then digging and squeezing underneath, lifting with her powerful neck and back muscles so that she could be free. But Hines had cut off that path to escape. He had reinforced the mesh of the pen with an even stouter wire, and had driven stout stakes of wood into the ground beside it. No matter how Lassie clawed and fought, it was no use. As if her defeat and the passing of time forced her even more energy, Lassie raced about inside the pen. She scratched at places where her instinct told her there might be a path to safety, but Hines had reinforced them all. Frantically, she lifted her head to bark in frustrated anger, and then, tentatively, she reared and stood on her hind legs against the wire, looking up. If you could go under a thing, you might go over it. Dogs can know these things, not by logical thought process, or because someone has told them that it must be so. Even the very smartest dogs know them only slowly and by hazy instinct and by training that they have had in their own short lives. So, dimly, and then more clearly, the new idea came to Lassie's mind. She leapt and fell back down again. The fence was 6 feet high, much too high for a collie to leap. A greyhound, or a borzoi, could have sailed over it easily. Dogs have been bred through the years to develop types for varying needs. Collies are of that group called working dogs, raised for centuries to work with man, to understand his words and signs, to be intelligent and to help him, and in these things they excel, but they cannot leap or race as can other types of dogs that have been perfected for these qualities alone. Lassie's leaping, therefore, brought her nowhere near the top of the wire. She turned back the length of the pen and raced in a running start, but each time she fell back. It seemed impossible, but with the courage and persistence of a good animal, she tried again and again, leaping at different spots as if one place might be more accessible than another. And one place was. She jumped right at the corner where the mesh joined at a right angle, and, while she was in the air, her driving hind legs found some support in the angle of the fence. She tried again, and this time, almost like a man climbing a ladder, she scrambled higher in a wild flurry of energy. She was almost at the top, and then she fell back again. But she had learned quickly. She turned and ran again, and this time held against the angle of wire by her own driving rush. Her feet clawed at the wire in that instant when the force of gravity was overcome. She struggled higher and higher, and her front paws reached the top. For a single second she hung there, and then slowly pulled herself upward. She teetered a moment, uncertainly. The top of the wire clawed at her belly, but she did not feel it. Only one thought was in her mind. It was time, the time to keep faith at a meeting place. She launched herself out and dropped to the ground, outside the pen. She was free! Now that she had achieved it, it seemed that all angry energy had left her. She had a clear way, instinct drove her to a new action. As if she knew that she would be captured again if she were seen, she moved warily as a dog can when it's hunting or being hunted. With her belly close to the ground, she slid across the path silently to the rhododendron thicket. The heavy foliage swallowed her. A second later, she was gliding like a ghost in the shadow of a wall far away. Her memory of terrain, like that of most animals, was perfect. She went silently, but with amazing speed, to a spot where the wall ended and the iron paling fence began. There was a hole under the fence there that she had found before, and she slid through it. As if she understood that this was the limit of a sort of enemy territory, her way of going now changed. She became normal again. She trotted calmly, her head erect, her full tail flowing behind in a graceful continuation of the curving lines of her body. She was just a glorious collie, trotting along happily, going through a routine of life without fuss or excitement. Here's a picture of Lassie as she's going along. Joe Caraclaw had never expected to see Lassie any more. After he had bidden her stay, after he scolded her for running home, he had really believed that she would never come to meet him at school anymore. But somewhere, down far in the depths of his hopes, he had dreamed of it without ever believing his dream would come true. And when he came from school that day and saw Lassie waiting, exactly as usual, he felt that it was not true. He was only living in his dreams. He stared at his dog, his broad, boyish face full of amazement. Then, as if his silence were a sign that her behavior had been worthy of disapproval, Lassie dropped her head. She wagged her tail slowly, asking forgiveness for the unknown sin she had committed. Joe Caraclaw dropped his hand to touch her neck. "It's all right, Lassie," he said slowly. "It's all right." He did not look at the dog, for his mind was racing, going far, far away in thought. He was remembering how, twice before, he had brought his dog home, and yet, despite all his hopes and pleadings, she had been taken away. So, he did not hurry gladly toward his home this time. Instead, he stood, his hand resting on the neck of his dog, his forehead wrinkled as he tried to puzzle out this problem of life. Hines thundered at the cottage door and walked in without waiting for an answer. "Come on, where is she?" he demanded. Mr. and Mrs. Caraclaw stared at him, and then their glances turned toward each other. The woman, her troubled eyes, seemed to pay no attention to Hines. "So that's why he's not home," she said. "Aye," the man agreed. Uh-oh. They're together, him and Lassie. She's got away again, and he's afraid to come home. He'll know that we'll take her back. He's run away, and with her, so's we can't take her back." She dropped to a chair, and her voice became unsteady. "Oh, my heavens! Shall I never have any peace and quiet in my home? Never any peace any more?" Her husband rose slowly, and then he went to the door. He took his cap from the peg and went back to his wife. "Now, don't be worried, lass," she said. Joe will not have gone far. Just up on the moors he'll head, and he won't get lost. Both him and Lassie know the moors too well for that." Hines seemed to ignore the despair of the people in the cottage. "Now, come on," he said. "Where's that there dog of mine?" Slowly, Sam Caraclaw turned to the little man. "That's what I'm off to find out, isn't it?" he said mildly. "Well, I'll just go along with yer," Hines said, "just to make sure there ain't no monkey business." For a moment, a great anger surged in Sam Caraclaw, and he strode toward the other man. Hines quailed quickly. "Now, don't ye start no trouble," he piped. "Ye better not start no trouble." Caraclaw stared down at the smaller man, and then, as if scorning one so beneath him in size and spirit, he went to the door. Then he turned. "You just go right home, Mr. Hines," he said. "Thy dog'll be back to thee just as soon as I find her." Then Sam Caraclaw went out into the dark evening. He did not go to the village. Instead, he went up the hill on the side street. Until he had reached the great, flat tableland that stretched foreboding and bleak for mile after mile over the northern country. He tramped forward steadily. It was soon dark, but if by instinct, his feet kept to the lightly worn paths which men had made in the hundreds of years of their going and coming over the wild country. A stranger might soon be lost in that land where there seemed no landmarks for guidance, but not any of the village men. All of their lives, when children at play, they had learned their country. They knew every inch of the moorland, and a twist in a path spoke to them as surely as their whereabouts as a street sign on a corner does to a city dweller. Surely then Joe's father strode, for he knew where to look for his son. 5 miles over the moor, the land broke into what was an island in the flatness, an island of outcropping rocks, great sharp-edged blocks, which looked much as if some strange long-ago giant child had begun to pile up building block towers, and then had deserted the game while it was only half finished. For it was there that the village people often wandered in their hours of trouble. The gaunt, forbidding rock towers, with their passages and caves, formed a place where one could sit in the vast silence and puzzle upon the problems of the world and of life without being disturbed by anyone. And it was there that Sam Caraclaw strode. He walked steadily through the darkness. The night rain began sweeping over the moor, fine and mist-like and insistent, but he did not slacken his step. At last the stone pile half loomed in the dark, and then, at his feet, stepped on the first echoing stones. Sam Carraclaw heard a sharp bark, a bark of a dog on watch, sounding a warning. So, it sounds like he's going to find them. That's as far as we're going to go today. I think the end of this chapter is much farther away from now, so we're going to stop now and continue with it tomorrow. You guys have a great night. Bye-bye.